During today's session, what we're going to produce is a white chicken stock, and then I'm also going to talk to you about various other chicken stocks, brown stock, fish stock and vegetable stock. By the end of the session, you should be able to produce a stock which has got a very good clarity, has a wonderful depth of flavour and a nice gelatinous consistency. We'll cover some basic rules and culinary terminology which are essential when making stock. So before we start, it's key that you check off that you've got all the appropriate equipment and ingredients which are listed in your kit list. Let's get started. So for this part, what we need to do is prepare our brown onions. For a white stock, what we want to do is peel away the skin. To do that, we chop away the root end, cut the onion in half, and then remove the outside peel. Peel our carrots, what we need to do is just using a peeler, remove the outside skin, and then we need to chop our carrots down into large pieces. Remember, our stock's going to cook for 3 to 4 hours, so we don't want these pieces to be too small, otherwise we'll break down during cooking. So when we're preparing the vegetables for a white stock, it's very important that the size of the vegetables is consistent and even and large enough so that they're not going to break down over the long period of cooking. We're going to cook this white stock for between 2 and 4 hours, so ideally the vegetables need to be between 5 and 6 centimetre pieces. For this stock, we're making a slight change to the recipe. We're omitting the celery because celery is actually an allergen. If you're making stocks commercially in a restaurant or for customers, you need to omit that ingredient because of the fact that it is an allergen. Making this stock at home would be fine to add celery if you wish to. Other vegetables that can't be put into stocks are things like starchy vegetables such as celeriac and potatoes. The reason being, over the long cooking period, they will just begin to break down and disintegrate, making your stock very cloudy. So other ingredients that we're going to add into our white stock are some button mushrooms. Just ensure that these are free from any soil and are nice and clean. What these are going to do in the stock is they're going to help absorb any excess fat and obviously give us a nice depth of flavour. Other ingredients that we're going to be adding into the stock are some aromats. We've got some hard herbs in thyme and bay leaf, some parsley stalks and some peppercorns. Mixture of bones in our white chicken stock include veal bones. In order to prep these veal bones, what we need to do is remove any excess fat. Excess fat, although it will add flavour, will make the stock very cloudy and greasy. So any excessive amounts of fat, using a small knife, we just want to trim and remove. Any bits of meat which are on the bone, obviously leave because they're going to add a good depth of flavour to our final stock. Okay, veal bones prepared. Next, what we need to do is prepare our chicken carcasses for the stock. It's very important that we remove any excess skin and fat from the chicken carcass, as this will make our stock greasy and cloudy. To do this, using your chef's knife, you just want to cut through and push the knife against the carcass in order to remove the excess skin. Parson nose is still intact, we want to remove that too. Any excess fat inside the carcass we need to remove also. And then finally, what we need to do is just check inside the carcass and make sure that any offal has been removed too. Obviously, offal, as it cooks for long periods, will make our stock very bitter. White stock, what we're using is a mixture of chicken and veal bones. The chicken bones are very rich in meat and they're going to impart a lovely chickeny flavour. Our veal bones, we use those because they're from a young animal, they're therefore very collagen rich. This collagen over the long cooking period will break down into gelatin. The gelatin is very important because what it does is it gives our stocks a wonderful viscosity, which is then translated into when we're making soups and braises and sauces. When cooking your stocks, it's very important to use a tall, narrow stock pot. The narrow stock pot will prevent rapid evaporation of the liquid and means that we can cook our stock over a very gentle, low heat. Our stock making process, we need to add our veal bones to the base of the pan. It's important that your veal bones go in first, because as they sit in the stock pan they absorb liquid and become very heavy. If they're on top of your chicken bones, they're likely to crush them and mean that they will potentially stick to the base of the pan and burn. So our veal bones in first, followed by our chicken carcasses. We need to cover our stock bones with cold water. The cold water is very important. It helps to bring the stock up very, very gently. This gentle process means that as the fat and impurity escapes from the bones, it coagulates into larger clumps, which makes it much easier when we come to skimming our stock. Making stock, it's very important that you use cold water. This cold water enables the fats and soluble proteins to very slowly coagulate, and therefore makes it very easy for you to skim. If we use hot water at that stage, what happens is those soluble fats and proteins disperse into the stock liquid, making the stock very cloudy and fatty. Stock up to the boil over a medium-high heat until you see the first signs of a bubble. You put your stock onto the boil, it's important that you then get your mise en place together, ready for as soon as that first bubble and boil comes up. We're going to have a jug of cold water, a bowl and ladle ready to skim any impurities from the surface. Cooking of the stock at this stage is known as blanching. What we're doing here is we're trying to release all of those fats and proteins so that we're able to then remove them from the stock, giving us a nice clarity to our stock. It's very important at this blanching phase that we have a jug of cold water on hand. This jug of cold water is there to help us depouler the stock. Depouler is a French term which basically means despoil. And what we're going to do is, as the stock comes up to the boil, we rapidly cool the stock with the cold water. This sets the fat and impurities on the surface of the stock, making it very easy for us to skim them away. At this stage, it's very important to remember your mise en place of your jug of cold water, ladle and glass bowl. Mise en place is essentially a French term which means everything in its place. Our stock has just come up to the boil. What we need to do is depouler, so adding that cold water which stops the stock from boiling and also helps to set any fat and impurities on the surface. And then using our ladle and our bowl, we need to remove all of these excessive bits of impurity and fat from the surface of our stock. At this stage, we've removed all the excess impurities and fat from the surface. What we need to do is ensure that our meat is recovered with cold water, and now we can gently bring the stock back up to a boil. With white stock, this process of depouler may need to be done 2 to 3 times to remove all the excess impurities and fat. Don't forget that your white stock will potentially need depouling 2 to 3 times. This is to ensure that we remove all the excess fat and impurities from the stock. So when making stocks, it's very important that you don't add salt to the stock. When you're making a stock, we're trying to extract all the flavour from the meat and vegetables which are in there. Post that, what we do is we reduce our stock, so any excess salt that we add, once reduced, is going to become very concentrated and make our stock very salty. Because it's been depoulered 2 to 3 times, what we need to do now is add in our vegetables. So to the top of our stock, we're going to add in our carrots, our onions, mushrooms, and finally our aromats. So once our vegetables have been added to our stock, what we need to do is we're going to begin the cooking process of our stock. So turning the heat down to very, very low, or as low as your stove can go, and cooking the stock for between 2 to 4 hours. As impurities rise to the surface, it may be necessary just to skim them very, very gently. At this stage, it's very important that we don't stir the stock, as this will release any fats and impurities which have been caught around the side of the pan. Now we're going to pass our stock. In order to pass our stock, what we need is a J-cloth, a chinoise, If you don't happen to have a chinoise at home, you can substitute this for a colander or a very sturdy sieve. What else we need is a large stock pot or container to strain our stock into. Sieve for straining of the stock, what we do is clip the J-cloth through the handles, and this holds the J-cloth in place as we're pouring through our stock ingredients. Place your sieve, chinoise or colander lined with the J-cloth over the top of your container or stock pot, ready to strain your stock. After 2 to 4 hours, remove your stock from the heat. Ensure that there are no impurities or excess fat on the surface. If there are, they need to be skimmed. And then what we need to do is strain our stock through our J-cloth lined chinoise. If the pan is quite heavy and full, begin by just gently ladling the stock. Once you feel comfortable, you can then lift the stock pan and begin to pour the stock through. Now we've strained our stock, what we need to do is reduce it. This reduction phase helps to concentrate the flavour in the stock and also makes it much easier in terms of storage. So placing our strained stock back into our tall stock pot pan over a high heat, and we're going to reduce this by half. So this is our final stock. It's now been nicely reduced. What we're looking for in a good quality chicken stock is that it is beautiful and crystal clear, no signs of any fat or impurity, and it has a good depth of flavour. At this stage, what we're looking for is that the stock should have a nice sort of stickiness to it, and that is that reduction where we've extracted all that lovely gelatin, which is going to give us a good consistency. When reducing stock, it's not essential that you reduce it by half. Reducing it by half basically makes it very easy to store. Depending on the recipe, if you're using your stock for a soup, it can more or less be used immediately straight from the pan. If you want a better concentration of flavour and better stickiness for braises or stews, then maybe reduce your stock by 2/3. Get the stock cool as rapidly as possible. For storage of stock, if you're going to freeze the stock, it's advisable to place it into a freezer-safe container. Something plastic or foil containers work well as well. Divide the stock between those containers and allow it to cool as quickly as possible. Bring down to room temperature, out of the fridge, and then as soon as you can, get these containers into the fridge. Once fully cold, then these can be placed into the freezer. Once your stock is into its containers and cool, you need to think about storage. Storing of a fresh stock in the refrigerator can be anything up to 3 days. If we're using a frozen stock, we need to store that for up to 3 months. If your stock is cold and has been stored in the fridge, it might become nice and gelatinous. That's a good thing. That's all the collagen which has been broken down into gelatin and has given your stock a really good viscosity. When using stock from frozen, you can use that stock directly into the saucepan that you're using, or alternatively pop it into a pan over a gentle heat and then bring to a boil. Depending on the concentration that you require, you can use unreduced stocks for things like soups and braises. What we would tend to use a heavily reduced stock for is things like sauces, pan sauces, or things like jus or espagnole. We've made a white stock, which is using fresh bones when cooking in our stock pot. Alternatives are brown stock. Basically, when you make a brown stock, what you do is you roast the bones before adding them into the water. That roasting phase caramelizes all the sugars around the meat, which gives it a better depth of flavour and also gives it a really good, attractive dark colour. So other stocks we can make include fish stock. Fish stock is a combination of fish frames and heads mixed with vegetables, water and aromats. It's very important when we make a fish stock that you remove any excess blood from the carcass, and this includes any gills which you might find in the head. Otherwise, these, as they cook, will release bitterness and impurities into the stock. Cooking of a fish stock can take anywhere between 20 and 30 minutes, so it's a very quick cooking process. Again, you can roast fish bones, making a brown fish stock. Vegetarian alternatives for stock. Of course, we can use multiple vegetables. Key things when making a vegetable stock, Still not using any starchy veg, so that's celeriac, potatoes, because they will break down and make the stock cloudy, but a mixture of our mirepoix of veg, carrots, celery, onions, a multitude of herbs, spices and mushrooms will give you a really delicious vegetable stock. Vegetable stocks don't need as long as meat stocks to cook, so you're talking about putting your vegetables nice and finely chopped into cold water and cooking for 20 to 30 minutes. Just to reiterate, for a brown chicken stock you would be cooking that stock for between 4 to 6 hours. The white chicken stock, which we've covered today, you'd be cooking for between 2 and 4 hours, and a fish stock for between 20 and 30 minutes. And if you're making a vegetable stock, that would tend to cook for about 30 minutes. During the session, we have covered the basic principles and methods for making a white chicken stock. You should understand the basic methods for making white stock and also how these methods can be applied to making other stocks, such as a brown chicken stock, fish stock and vegetable stock. You should also understand the cooking times for these various stocks and also storage and freezing of stock. Continuing to practice making stock means that this technique will become much easier for you. Reducing and freezing the stock means that you can use this stock later in the course when we come on to making things like soups and braises. So that's stock covered. Next up, we're going to learn about knife skills.